In this class we're going to look at an introduction to research. Now, research may be undertaken for two different purposes. First of all, to solve a problem. Now, this is known as applied research. Or it could be to contribute to the general body of knowledge in a particular area of interest. This is known as fundamental research, or sometimes basic research. For example, mathematics or theoretical physics. These subjects are used to add to our knowledge of a subject area. So we have two types. One, applied research, trying to fix something or get an insight into some phenomenon or into some situation. Generally speaking, business research is applied. Now, the ways to select a topic, well, it could be based on personal experience. It could be the managing director of a business has a theory about some aspect of the market and has experienced something in the context of trading in a particular market. So some personal experience, and he or she wants some research conducted into it. Now, that would be applied research based on some personal experience. Or it could just be some curiosity based on something. For example, some topic in the news. Someone wants to find out something more about some issue in news or in current affairs. It could be the state of knowledge in a field. In general, the greater the knowledge in an area, the greater the possibilities of research. So some areas of investigation, some areas of study are very well researched, but that in itself may engender more research, may suggest more research needs to be done in certain aspects of what was already found, maybe to extend what was already found or bring it up to date, or perhaps shed new light on some previous research. It could be research is based on social benefit, and that the research will lead to greater understanding of society. So it may not be in business or in fundamental research in mathematics or physics. It could be just some research which will give an indication of how society is structured, or what are the trends in society, current trends in society. And of course, research could be based on personal values and beliefs. People believe certain things and they want to research as to whether their beliefs are accurate or not accurate, or get some greater insight into their own beliefs. Now, there are major limitations in conducting a research. The first major consideration is time. Time is money. But it takes time to conduct research. Sometimes people don't have the time. They don't have the resources in terms of time necessary to conduct proper research. And of course, time is money, which is cost. And cost can take various forms. It could be time, as I said. It could be salary. The researchers need to be paid. They need to live while they're conducting the research. There's travel costs perhaps involved in the research. Or it needs back office. It needs paper, printing, support, computers, telephones. So there are costs involved in research. Access to resources. The research activity requires the appropriate resources. Also, the research needs to be approved by authorities. Some research may require prior approval from some relevant authority, for example from the police, depending on the nature of the inquiry. Or it might need approval from some employer. If someone's going to investigate the attitude of workers towards some business issue, the employer perhaps needs to be consulted. So research just can't be conducted, it needs to be approved. And there are ethical concerns, and care must be taken to address those ethical concerns. Just looking at issues without reference to any issues that could rise as a consequence is wrong. It's necessary to consider the ethical situation that is posed by a lot of research, particularly research into sociological areas or into medical areas, or even research into business areas which may affect the product or the reputation of a product, which may damage the reputation of a product, which will mean a business may go out of existence and workers will lose jobs. Research has to be handled carefully. And the researchers must have an expertise in conducting the research. They can't just set off and conduct the research without being prepared and without being trained. So it's not just some casual function that can be slotted in on top of other activities. Research is, it requires training. The researchers need to be able to deal with situations, and they need to be able to find objective answers if possible. They need to be able to find the truth. Now, there are 6 assumptions in qualitative design. Qualitative researchers are concerned primarily with process rather than outcomes or products. The qualitative researchers are looking at the process of the research itself, and they need to be skilled in dealing with the process of research, skilled, I should say, in asking questions and looking at the context of the research and taking issues into account as the research is being processed and being conducted. They're trying to find the meaning of the answers in the context in which the answers were given. They've posed the question, they got the answer. Now they need to look at the environment and look at the history and look at the culture and look at the person who's given the answer and try to determine bias and try to determine issues that may mitigate the answer, may change the answer or may change the understanding of the answer given. The qualitative researcher is the primary instrument for data collection and analysis. The researcher is the instrument. It's the researcher who's collecting the information. It's the researcher who is gathering the information and processing the information. So the researcher is all important in qualitative analysis. Data is assessed, measured and processed by the researcher. So the researcher is all important. Qualitative research involves fieldwork. The researcher physically goes to the people's setting, the site or the institution, to observe or record behaviour in its natural setting. So the researcher goes out into the fieldwork. The respondents, generally speaking, do not go to the researcher's office. The researcher goes to the people. It's qualitative. They are taking into account all the variables, the person's responses, the setting in which the responses were given. All of the factors should be taken into account. And it's descriptive in that the researcher is interested in process, meaning, and understanding gained through words or pictures. So it's descriptive in that sense. It's trying to take everything into account, a wide variety of sources of information. The process of qualitative research is inductive in that the researcher builds abstractions, concepts and hypotheses and theories from details. So the researcher goes out into the community or into the area where the research is being conducted, makes observations, makes wide observations of all the phenomena around, the setting for the research, then poses the questions, gets the answers, and tries to induce from that and from all that information what are the key relationships. So they're moving in that direction. Now with quantitative methods, well, here we're dealing with descriptive statistics, graphical and numerical techniques for summarizing data. So we have a data set, we have perhaps a big set of data, and we're trying to represent what are the patterns in the data. So we might use graphical or numerical techniques to try and summarize the data, to try and get a clear picture of what the data is saying. It's descriptive. It's also inferential. It means we're trying to make generalizations about characteristics of the population based on information obtained from a sample taken from that population. So if we draw a sample from a wide data set, now that's a cheap way of doing the analysis, taking a sample rather than dealing with everything. And then we're trying to generalize from the sample. That's inferential statistics. We're moving from the sample to the population. We work out what the average of the sample is, and we say, well, therefore, the average of the population is this, plus or minus a margin of error. So if we work out the average of the sample is 10, then we'd say, well, okay, the average of the population is 10, plus or minus 2. So it's somewhere between 8 and 12. So inferential is looking at trying to move from samples to populations. Let's look at some definitions. First of all, a population, well, that's any set of individuals or objects having some common observable characteristics. That's what we mean by a population. So there could be the population of cars in the country, or the population of television sets in the country. It's the population. It's the number of objects with some certain observable characteristics. A sample is a subset of the population which represents the characteristics of the population. So a subset of cars could be sports cars. A sample consists of respondents or subjects. A sample is our selected respondents. In other words, the sample could be every 10th person. Or better still, it could be a random sample. If we know all of the population, give all the population a number and then draw out 50 random numbers and then go and interview those 50. That's a random sample, and that is a good practice. An informant is a person who informs. The research may be based on a single person, for example, perhaps a politician, but the research could equally be based on a number of informants. Now, the word informant has got somewhat a sinister connotation, but the way we use it here is an informant is a person who informs. Throughout these classes, I tend to refer to an informant as a respondent, the person who responds to questions or to situations. Now let's look at features of quantitative and qualitative research. We'll do this in a small table. For qualitative research, they're looking at a complete description. They're looking at the setting, they're looking at the information collected, so it's a complete description. Quantitative looks at classifying features and counting and analyzing what is measured. So with quantitative, you start with a data set. The data set, generally speaking, might be some numbers. So it looks at the numbers and analyzes the numbers to try and find relationships. With qualitative, the research question may not be fully articulated. The research question may not be fully understood. The research question may be very broad and very generalized at the start, and only when the research is being conducted does the research question become clear. So it starts off quite wide, quite amorphous almost, and as the research is being conducted, the issues start to emerge, and those will form the basis of the inquiry. Whereas with quantitative, there are very clear questions at the start. The data set is perhaps resident on a particular computer with appropriate software, and the researcher poses the hypothesis. What is the relationship between the price and the quantity sold? So the hypothesis is that the price determines the quantity sold. That's the hypothesis. It's a clear question. Is that true? And then it looks at the data. It uses some statistical technique to determine whether it's true or not. For qualitative research, it may arise out of the need for elaboration in earlier research. Sometimes a piece of research is conducted and they make recommendations to say future research is necessary here to shed more light on this particular topic, and that inspires future research. And with quantitative, the research may be based on recommendations or questions arising out of previous research. Very similar. Sometimes researchers in quantitative areas suggest that the data was insufficient, or the data was too historic. It needs to have more modern data, more up-to-date data, or whatever. So it's suggesting more research is required into the area. With qualitative research, it's more flexible. Qualitative is more flexible. A rigid design is based on careful planning in quantitative. Quantitative requires a rigid based approach. Qualitative is more flexible. So qualitative is flexible, quantitative more rigid. The hypothesis is stated and tested. Qualitative, flexible. It emerges. With qualitative, the researcher is the instrument for the research as well. Qualitative, the researcher is the instrument for the research. The qualitative asks the questions, makes the observations, processes the information, does the analysis. The researcher is the instrument of the research. With quantitative, there are tools such as questionnaires and computer algorithms and data sets, which may be perhaps secondary data which has been processed in a unique fashion, which makes it original. But for quantitative, it's looking at tools such as questionnaires. It's looking at the results picked up in questionnaires and then doing some quantitative work on the responses in the questionnaires, coding the questionnaires and doing some quantitative work on the questionnaires. Qualitative data is in the form of words and pictures and objects. So qualitative research is not necessarily numeric. It could be verbal descriptions of situations. It could include pictures or drawings or artifacts. Whereas with quantitative, the data is numbers. So the data in the form of qualitative, much more flexible. words, pictures, artifacts, objects. With qualitative, the interpretation of the data is subjective. It's open to interpretation. It's open to the investigator to draw conclusions. Perhaps with the same data, with the same words, pictures and objects, a different researcher may draw a slightly different conclusion. With quantitative, the data is objective. Having fed it into the computer, fed the data into the computer and worked out the hypothesis that's been tested, the computer crunches the numbers, brings back the result. That's objective. So it doesn't matter what the feelings of the researcher is, that's what has emerged. For qualitative, the data is rich. In other words, there are many sources of data. As I said earlier, artifacts, pictures, sounds, the whole setting, the history, the background. All of that is data. It's rich, but it's time consuming and it's not easily generalized because the same type of research conducted in a different area will have different settings, different history, different artifacts, so it can't be easily generalized. For the quantitative research, then the data is amenable to testing. Finally, for qualitative, there's a danger that the researcher may become immersed in the subject matter. There is a danger in qualitative research that the researcher gets caught up in the situation and becomes biased. Whereas with quantitative, the researcher is more objective and must stay objective because the data is objective. It's a data set that's testing some hypothesis. Now, there are 6 assumptions of qualitative designs. First of all, qualitative researcher looks at the process, the record, and they look at the circumstances of the research, and they look at the insights they're trying to gain. So the qualitative research is looking at process and looking at circumstances. That's the first point. Secondly, qualitative researchers are interested in meaning and understanding. What's going on? What's the context of the research and how is it influencing the outcome? The qualitative researchers are the instruments of the data being collected. So the qualitative researchers collect the data, do the analysis, present the data. They are the instruments of the research. Qualitative research involves fieldwork, usually observing or recording behavior in its natural setting. So it normally is conducted where the events are taking place. So it involves fieldwork, making observations and recording behaviors in natural settings. Qualitative research is descriptive. It describes what's happening. The researcher is interested in meaning and understanding gained through words or pictures, or words and pictures, or words and pictures and sounds. So the qualitative researcher is taking a wide variety of sources into account. The process of qualitative research may be seen as inductive because the researcher may build abstractions and concepts and hypotheses and theories from observed details. So it could be seen as inductive. It could be seen that the researcher is working from particular observations and trying to generalize. But of course the whole process of generalization is complicated because of the settings for the research will vary from place to place. The background to the research will vary. The respondents will vary. The pictures, the words, the sounds, they will vary. So it's very difficult to generalize. So what we've got when we look at the contrast between quantitative and qualitative designs, there really are two different approaches. The qualitative approach is based on particular situations, based in situ, based in where they happened. The researcher goes there, it's field work. The researcher goes there, makes observations and tries to make sense of the observations, taking a wide variety of sources into account. With quantitative techniques, with quantitative work in general, the researcher has a data set which may come from questionnaires, or it may come from past observations, or it may come from secondary sources of information. But the researcher has a data set, and the researcher poses a question and uses a statistical technique to answer the question. So it becomes much more objective. Qualitative research is subjective. It's open to the interpretation by the researcher. Quantitative research, much more objective. Two approaches. So that's all we're going to do on this topic. It's an important topic because it contrasts two big ways in which research may be conducted. That's what I'm going to do for the moment. I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.